Over the next month, I'm going to be looking at senryu, at why senryu are often seen as a lesser form of poetry, at senryu in the pre-modern era in Japan, that's before 1868, and how they developed from that point on, both in Japan and in the English-speaking world. It's been a fascinating study from a poetry and an historical point of view. You know how much I like a bit of history. I've always thought that haiku can instruct us about life in the past, but as I hope to show you, senryu can give you a fascinating insight into the past too. It's also left me with a couple of historical events which have a bearing on our poetry that I'll bring you sometime in the future. Before we continue, a reminder to make sure you're signed up to the Poetry Pea mailing, as a very important email will be going out very, very soon, which if you write poetry, you really don't want to miss. Also, a favour, if you could review the podcast or like and share it, or all of the above, then that would be fantastic. We had a lot of new contributors to the last couple of submission periods, so I know you're helping me with this, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart, truly. As I said, over the next month, I'm going to be looking at senryu, and today I'm going to start with pre-modern senryu, that's before 1868. At the end of my podcasts, and there'll be at least 2, maybe more, I'll have an essay for you. The lovely bunch of people who support me with memberships will be sent a copy, but it will be available to everyone via Buy Me a Coffee. So let's get started. Pre-modern senryu, before 1868. Masashi Kobayashi observed that senryu poets always seem to be conscious of haiku, but haiku poets are almost indifferent to the world of senryu poetry. That could be a sweeping generalization, but what does seem to be true is that often senryu are deemed to be a lesser form of poetry than haiku. Haiku and senryu share the same roots. They come from waka and thereafter linked verse. If you remember from my essay, Haikai Poetry and the Use of Honkadori and Honzetsu, I explained that in the time of the Manyoshi, around AD 759, courtly poets were writing waka poetry with wit and humour. And I gave you a couple of examples. The first is a waka. In this world of ours, we eat and we defecate, we sleep and get up, and after all of this, well, all that's left is to die. In this world of ours, we eat and we defecate, we sleep and get up, and after all this, well, all that's left is to die. And this one, a linked verse, which takes the form, eventually, of a waka. A robe of mist, soaked at the hem, Princess Saho, with the coming of spring, stands pissing. A robe of mist, soaked at the hem, Princess Saho, with the coming of spring, stands pissing. The second, the linked verse, was an example of a more bawdy poem and was written, as you can see, at a later date to the first one. Now, prior to 1603, the Osaka-Kyoto region was the dominant force in cultural and the literary world in Japan. The royal court was here, and much of the serious poetry was written by courtiers in that courtly, polite fashion. Or at least in courtly language. Sometimes, as I've said, it was quite bawdy. Humorous poetry was on the increase in the 16th and 17th century, some of it quite lewd. There were conflicting opinions as to the value of this work. In the early to mid-17th century, the Taimon school of haikai encouraged the refinement of the form. But the Danrin school, which came to prominence in the latter half of the 17th century, wanted to return to a wittier form. A follower of the Taimon school said of the Danrin verses that they are only puns in the worst sense and are as light and as worthless as pumice stones. So, the devaluing or the undervaluing of the Whittier poem is definitely not a contemporary thing. It was from the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, that we see senryu really emerge as its own distinct form. The senryu poem written at this time were known as Edo senryu, senryūten, or kosenryu, old senryu. They developed from verse capping, more particularly from verse capping contests, known as the meikuzuki, with apologies for my pronunciation. Meikuzuki were originally a device used by haiku masters to teach verse capping. Kikaku, one of Basho's disciples, was heavily involved with them. This educational device evolved into competitions. Donald Keane proposes that these competitions could have begun as early as the 1660s, but can definitely be traced back to the Kamigata region in the 1680s, spreading from there to Edo. So how did the meikuzuki competition work? A referee known as the tenja would offer a verse, a meiku, to be capped. This verse could be 2 or 3 lines, but more often than not, 2, which poets would cap with a tsukiku of 3 lines to follow a 2-line meiku, or 2 if following a 3-line meiku. I have an example for you. The meiku, something absurd, something absurd. The tsukiku, it was like this, bigger and bigger with each telling, the fishing lie. And the totality of the verse would be something absurd, something absurd. It was like this, bigger and bigger with each telling, the fishing lie. One thing to note about the tsukiku written in much of the Edo period was that the poet either didn't sign their work or they used a pseudonym. But documents do exist to tell us what sort of person was writing them. From the Nemonogatari, we learn that Sansho, a pseudonym, was a day labourer. Other writers mentioned in this essay are firemen, storytellers, a landlord, a steward, an ivory sculptor, an embroiderer, a tavern owner, a noodle shop operator, a lantern seller, a cook, a plasterer, a Zen monk, and a friar. So people involved in very ordinary occupations, at least for those times. The poems were not, however, all written by the working classes. There were poetry groups in Edo districts where the warrior classes lived, who took part in these competitions. And I have an example of a tsukiku from Tayashu Munetake, who was the son of a shogun, no less. He was well known for his waka, and he also entered meikuzuki competitions. Let's hear what he wrote. The meiku first. What happy timing, what happy timing. And the tsukiku, the paperweight space. Just when it returns to its sheath, warm sake is ready. And the verse in full. What happy timing, what happy timing. The paperweight space. Just when it returns to its sheath, warm sake is ready. You might wonder what all that was about, but in combination with the meiku, the tsukiku suggests that the author is relieved, having written a letter of some difficulty, and now he can relax and enjoy his sake. Why were tsukiku written mainly anonymously? Partly this can be explained by the organization of the meikuzuki. The tenja, usually a gentleman, would deliver his meiku to several poetry clubs. The leader of the club would deliver the tsukiku back to the tenja without the names of the poet on the poems. The poems were, after all, in competition, and prizes could be run. So to ensure fairness, they were judged anonymously. But in addition to that, some of the poems could be quite scathing, often poking fun at people of power. And that's another reason for the anonymity, to allow these poets to write freely and without fear of reprisal. Now, once a haiku was offered, the poets would pay a fee to be included in the competition. And Ueda is quite scathing about meikuzuki masters and tenjas, saying that many people with meager poetic talents declared themselves tenja. Anyone who knew a little bit about verse writing could become a master, since all he needed to do was come up with haiku and distribute them to various poet groups. He goes on to suggest that many haiku masters and tenjas were more interested in gathering the fees for the competition than developing the talents of the poets, and says that very few great verses came from the meikuzuki before the mid-18th century. Maybe he has a point. But what happened in the latter half of the 18th century to improve things? Well, there was a gentleman called Karai Senryu who started his own meikuzuki competitions in 1757. He became recognized as one of the most influential meikuzuki master and tenja of his time. And as you may have guessed, he gave his name to the form that was emerging through his competitions. Ueda speculates that Mr. Senryu was successful as a tenja who developed quality work from poets for several reasons. He wrote good open-ended haiku, allowing contestants to really go for it and give full rein to their imagination. He was a strong leader. He had a good critical sense of poetry. And he, as many of the tenja did, edited the poems before they were published. Ueda suggests that because he opened his competition only to those who dwelt within the Edo area, it made the poems stronger. I'm not sure about that. Maybe that speaks more to why the publication of the competition results and the number of poets taking part increased dramatically. He was a big fish in a small but highly populated pool. If you have thoughts about that, do let me know. Anyway, what was emerging from the work of Mr. Senryu and the poets who entered his competitions became evident when in 1765, the first anthology of some of the winning poems from his competitions were published, the Yanagidaru. Goryokin Arubeshi, who was a contemporary of Mr. Senryu, was the editor of this anthology, and he published the Tsukiku without the haiku, saying that he had selected verses that could be easily understood by themselves. And of course, it was the Tsukiku which eventually became known as senryu. So the Yanagidaru was a bestseller, and although it was meant to be a one-off, a couple of years later a second was produced, and thereafter it became an annual event. And again, I have a couple of examples for you. A Tsukiku from 1770. Caught in the act, he flees, throwing away a spray of blossoms. Caught in the act, he flees, throwing away a spray of blossoms. And one from a year later, 1771. No trespassing. Thanks to the sign, you find a shortcut. No trespassing. Thanks to the sign, you find a shortcut. This anthology, the Yanagidaru, only ceased publication in 1838. But the quality of the Tsukiku was declining. In fact, it began to decline in the late 1780s before the death of Mr. Senryu and Goryokin. We can theorize as to why it was. Perhaps initially it was something to do with the aging of the two dominant figures in the world of meikuzuki. Perhaps it had something to do with the shortness of the form itself. Many argue in haiku and senryu that the form restricts creativity. I reject that argument. The subject matter of haiku and senryu are on the one hand constant. We write of seasons or about humans. But on the other hand, our subject matter is ever changing. Look at our climate. Look at humans ourselves, our opinions, what we do, technology. Honestly, it'd be very difficult for poets to exhaust the possibilities of these art forms. What is certain is that other forms of humorous literature had exploded onto the scene in Edo, which were in direct competition with Meikozuki. Kibyōshi, a type of popular fiction using the same type of humor as senryu, became increasingly popular from 1775 onwards. And koyoka, otherwise known as madwaka, became extremely popular in the literary circles of Edo from the 1880s onwards. And finally, possibly the kicker, in the 1790s, the shogunate, alarmed at the explosion of satire, issued laws restricting freedom of publication, which, as you can imagine, had a detrimental effect. Publishers had to be very careful what they published. Perhaps something very similar is going on in our world at the moment. I'll say no more. But to return to where I started, haiku and senryu have their roots in waka and linked verse. And so whilst there are poems which are clearly haiku and clearly senryu these days, there are poems along the short form continuum which could be described as either. But let's concern ourselves with senryu at the far end of the haiku senryu scale. What were the characteristics of the tsukiku, or senryu as I'll continue to refer to them, in the pre-modern era? A senryu referred to aspects of the human condition. According to Ogawa Akimichi, they were playful verses that comment on human behaviors, virtues and vices, noble and base emotions, thoughts of upper and lower class people, and all the other matters that make up this life on earth. I quite like that definition. So they deal with humans, nature, character, and life in casual, everyday situations, often, but not always, comically, with satire. Whether comic or not, though, they convey an immediate sense of humanity to their readers. They don't need to have a kirei, a cut, and at the end of the senryu scale we're exploring, they do not mention seasons. Let me give you a few examples. Living alone, a fart just isn't that funny. Living alone, a fart just isn't that funny. Possibly because, I grew up in the UK. I always find a bit of toilet humour quite amusing. But I think it translates around the world. Hangover, trying to think where I drank. Hangover, trying to think where I drank. The last words gradually sinking lower and lower. The last words gradually sinking lower and lower. And so in this one, which speaks about the end of life, we can see senryu do not always have to be comedic, but it is really about the human condition, isn't it? Now let's have a look at some of the common themes of senryu in the pre-modern era. Ridiculing the higher echelons of society, and of course the samurai were up there, weren't they, at the time? A last resort. A samurai puts his soul in pawn. A last resort. A samurai puts his soul in pawn. And for those of you listening on the audio rather than looking at the slides, I'm spelling pawn P-A-W-N. And this poem is really talking about a samurai down on his luck. There was possibly one of the major themes of taking the mickey out of the higher echelons was when people were down on their luck. And The sword apparently was seen as part of a samurai's soul. And so this samurai, bless his cotton socks, was so down on his luck that he had to pawn his sword. A last resort, a samurai puts his soul in pawn. Cutting corners, the nursemaid doubles as his mistress. Cutting corners, the nursemaid doubles as his mistress. Another common theme was to take the mickey out of priests and the state. The priest admits to the courtesan, there's no such thing as hell. The priest admits to the courtesan, there's no such thing as hell. The civil servant's baby is very good at learning how to grasp. The civil servant's baby is very good at learning how to grasp. Another theme was the sort of rigidity of thinking or stubbornness. I think this one illustrates it quite well. Samurai's quarrel doesn't end until it produces 2 widows. Samurai's quarrel doesn't end until it produces 2 widows. The next example shows you incongruity. A poem about something that you wouldn't expect. Let me show you. The Zen monk, done with his meditation, looks for fleas. The Zen monk, done with his meditation, looks for fleas. So we have a Zen monk being all Zen. But when he's done, it switches and he starts doing normal things like looking for fleas. It's quite revolting, isn't it, really? And also, they wrote about naivety and innocence. I thought this was a lovely example. The toddler struggling to get a handle on a melon. The toddler struggling to get a handle on a melon. We can all see it, can't we? And now a couple of examples about love. Or perhaps I should say, satirizing love. To put it briefly, courting is tantamount to begging. To put it briefly, courting is tantamount to begging. At the trysting house, the pair decides it's time to pull out. At the trysting house, the pair decides it's time to pull out. And the battle of the sexes was always a great one to write about. You're divorced, but his wife, who's heard it all before, just sits there, smoking. You're divorced, but his wife, who's heard it all before, just sits there, smoking. Days when I win, she doesn't tell me off. That's women for you. Days when I win, she doesn't tell me off. That's women for you. I imagine this gentleman to have a bit of a gambling habit. Poets often wrote about family life too. I thought this one was a very touching piece. Though she's asleep, the fan keeps moving. Motherly love. Though she's asleep, the fan keeps moving. Motherly love. One wants to save and the other to spend. Incessant warfare. One wants to save and the other to spend. Incessant warfare. I guess that's family life battle of the sexes, maybe even love. The chaps writing poems at the time wrote also about the types of entertainment they were enjoying. We've seen a bit in the love section about courtesans, for example. But they also went to the theatre. And here's one about a trip to the theatre. Starting to kill himself, the actor stops to watch a fight in the audience. Starting to kill himself, the actor stops to watch a fight in the audience. Now, I've said that poets would write about the state, about people higher up the social scale than them, but they'd also write about heroes from the here and now or the past, about gods, etc. So this next poem could fit in the bit where they're poking fun at people higher up the social scale, but it could also fit in with a poem about heroes and heroines. Cockroach on board. The former empress and her suite all stood up. Cockroach on board. The former empress and her suite all stood up. And finally, just to remind people that senryu are about everyday life. And when I read this poem, I thought, oh, yes, that does describe something that happens. And it tackles a sad theme, but in quite a funny way. Long walk to the graveyard. The mourners trudge on, speaking ill of the deceased. Long walk to the graveyard. The mourners trudge on, speaking ill of the deceased. And here's a little picture of everyday life that I can just see myself doing. She asks the price of things she doesn't want, sheltering from the rain. She asks the price of things she doesn't want, sheltering from the rain. So that's the poetry I have to illustrate what was going on in the pre-modern senryu world. Next time, I'm going to turn to senryu post-1869, the period when things were changing dramatically in Japan. It was opening itself up to the West and becoming very curious about the literature Western writers were producing. So we'll continue this journey of senryu in a couple of weeks. Next time, I have a reading from a lovely Irish poet to give us a little view of life on an Irish farm. Do join me and my guest and relax to the sound of his lovely voice, giving us an insight to his Irish world. See you next week. Until then, keep writing. There won't be too many things in the show notes this week, but as I said, once I've finished doing all the senryu, I'll put together an essay and that will be available, and you can have a good read of the development of the senryu form. But for now, ciao!